Welcome to Crisis and Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today we're doing a deep dive into a text that, I think it's fair to say, completely upends the traditional story of America. It's Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States.
Right. And when most of us think about history, especially the history we got in school, it feels like a very specific, almost official story.
Yeah. It's a story about nations being built.
And it's always told through the actions of, the great men, the presidents, the generals, the big inventors.
That's the default setting. Zinn gives it a name, actually borrowing from Henry Kissinger, of all people. He calls it the memory of states.
The memory of states.
It's history told completely from the top down. The perspective is always that of the leaders, the diplomats, the conquerors. And Zinn's whole point is that this isn't just a choice of style. It's a choice that serves a very, very specific systemic purpose.
And that purpose, I take it, is to sell the idea of national unity.
Exactly. The pretense is that the nation is, one big happy family, a community with a common purpose, a shared national interest.
Which sounds good on the surface.
It sounds great,
Yeah.
but it's an incredibly powerful framing because it completely obscures the real brutal conflicts happening inside that so-called community.
You mean the struggles between different groups?
I mean the fierce, continuous struggles between conquerors and the conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers. When you only tell the story of the state, all of those internal fractures just sort of vanish from the picture.
But I can hear critics saying, hold on, don't you need some sense of patriotism, of a national interest for society to even function? It's messy, but maybe it's necessary.
And that's where the analysis gets really critical. Zinn says, okay, let's look at what we call progress. Things like westward expansion or industrial growth. We're taught to see them as normal, maybe even inevitable.
Right, the price of building a nation.
But they were only normal and inevitable from one point of view, right? The viewpoint of the powerful few who benefited. For the millions who were displaced or enslaved or exploited in factories, for them, that progress was something else entirely.
It was violence.
It was organized violence. It was systematic dispossession. History, in that sense, is just the story the winners tell to justify what they did.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're looking at this book as a counter-narrative. We're trying to see history not as a list of dates and events that just had to happen,
but as a system of power, a system where controlling the story, controlling the narrative is everything. It dictates whose life is remembered as important and whose suffering is just quietly buried.
And doing that requires making a very deliberate choice about whose story you're going to tell.
It does. It requires deliberately selecting and emphasizing the stories of the people who are usually left out. Because, as Zinn argues, if you only ever listen to the powerful, you lose your moral compass. You completely forget what justice even means. He has this line that's just so powerful.
What about the cry of the poor?
Yes. He says you will never know what justice is if you don't listen to the cry of the poor and the oppressed.
And that perspective, that choice, seems like it comes directly from the author's own life. Let's talk a bit about Howard Zinn himself.
He had a really fascinating and very engaged life. He wasn't some academic born of a silver spoon. He was the son of working-class immigrant parents in New York.
He worked in a shipyard for a while, didn't he?
For 3 years, yeah. So he had this very personal, firsthand experience with labor, with class conflict, long before he ever became a history professor. It wasn't abstract for him.
He also had a pretty surprising military background for someone who became such a vocal critic of American foreign policy. He was in the Air Force in World War II.
He was, and this is absolutely crucial to understanding him. He was a bombardier. He flew missions over Europe, and near the very end of the war, he took part in a mission to drop napalm, this new, horrifyingly incendiary weapon.
On a French town, of all places.
On the French town of Royan, yes. And the thing is, the German forces had already basically bypassed it. It was full of French civilians waiting for the war to end.
My God, to be a part of that, and then to realize what you'd done.
It was a defining moment for him. That experience of seeing the human cost of state action, even when it's wrapped in a flag, that, plus his later activism, it just demanded a completely new way of looking at history.
And that activism was intense.
It really was. After the war, he got a teaching job at Spelman College.
An all-black women's college in Atlanta.
Right in the heart of the Jim Crow South. And he got deeply involved in the civil rights movement. He wasn't just observing it. He was advising student groups, participating in sit-ins, going on voter registration drives. He was on the front lines of that struggle. And then came his very public, very passionate opposition to the Vietnam War.
So he's not writing about history from some quiet, isolated library. He's on the ground watching the system fail people in real time.
Precisely. And by the time he sits down to write a people's history, he's come to this realization that traditional history loves to claim it's objective, that it just presents the facts without a point of view.
Which he argues is impossible.
He says it's not just impossible, it's a deception. He argues that the very act of selecting what to include and what to leave out, what to emphasize, these aren't just, technical necessities.
He compares it to a map maker.
Right. Yeah, that's the analogy. A map maker has to distort the globe to make it flat. Greenland always looks huge. That's a technical necessity. But a historian, Zinn says, makes ideological choices. The distortions serve a purpose.
So the distortion isn't for usability. It's to support a certain interest group, be it economic, political, or racial.
Absolutely. Just think about the story of Columbus. The traditional narrative emphasizes his bravery, his skill as a navigator, this heroic spirit of discovery.
And the genocide that followed is?
A footnote. It's a footnote, or it's mentioned and then quickly dismissed. And Zinn says that is an ideological choice. It serves to justify what happened. It quietly suggests that, yes, terrible things occurred, but they were the necessary price of progress. Or it buries the moral horror so deep that you, the reader, feel totally disconnected from it.
Which brings us right to the book's core thesis, his main point.
The core message is this: we have to reject the memory of states as our own.
We have to stop thinking of nations as unified communities.
Because they're not. They never have been. And when history is told as the story of one nation moving forward together, it's actively hiding the brutal, violent conflicts between the powerful and the powerless. So Zinn says, okay, I'm going to consciously pick a side.
He chooses to tell the story from the perspective of the people at the bottom.
The Arawaks, the slaves, the Cherokees, the women in the mills, the workers on strike. He chooses their viewpoint.
But again, the critic would say, why should a historian intentionally be biased? Isn't the goal supposed to be balance?
Zinn's answer to that is, I think, very pragmatic. He essentially says, look at the shelves. There's already a mountain of history books that lean so heavily in one direction, in favor of governments, of conquerors, of the elite.
So his book isn't meant to be the only story.
It's a counterweight. It's an intentionally biased counterforce that's necessary just to get the scales somewhere closer to balance. It's not about some perfect, neutral 50-50 split. It's about providing the information, the perspective that the system has spent centuries actively suppressing, because without it, we can't even begin to have a conversation about justice.
Okay, so let's dig into that. Let's start with the most dramatic example he uses right at the beginning of the book to illustrate this exclusion, the so-called discovery of America.
This is his opening salvo, he's asking, whose voices are completely erased from that official story. And he systematically points to these huge invisible populations. You have women who are half the population but are barely mentioned. You have the poor.
Yeah.
And you have entire oppressed groups like slaves and, of course, Native Americans.
And he starts not with Columbus's ships, but with the people who were already there.
The Arawaks of the Bahama Islands. He doesn't begin with the ships on the horizon. He begins with the people on the shore looking out. And he does this specifically to show the massive gulf between these two worlds and the instantaneous, brutal logic of conquest.
He describes their society in a way that sounds almost, idyllic compared to the Europe of the time.
It's a stark contrast. He quotes Columbus's own log. The Arawaks came out of their villages to greet them, naked, tawny, and full of wonder. They swam out to the ships. Zinn highlights their communal values.
They shared everything.
They shared goods freely, lived in communes, and, this is the most important part, they placed no value on gold and other precious things. Their society was also often matrilineal, where women had real standing and authority. It was a radical opposite to the hierarchical, patriarchal, gold-obsessed culture that Columbus represented.
And from the very first moment Columbus lays eyes on them, his thoughts turn from discovery to something much darker.
Immediately. It's right there in his own words, which Zinn quotes directly from the log. Columbus writes, "They willingly traded everything they owned. Then, they do not bear arms." And then, the chilling conclusion, "They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want."
The speed of that calculation is just terrifying.
It is. It's that moment of crisis in perception. He doesn't see other people. He sees resources. He sees their generosity not as a virtue to be admired, but as a weakness to be exploited.
And the resource he wanted above all else was gold.
That was the obsession. That was the engine. When he finds a few small gold ornaments on Hispaniola, his entire mission pivots to what Marx would later call primitive accumulation.
The violent extraction of wealth to fuel Europe's new money economies.
Exactly. His second voyage isn't about exploration. It's a massive expedition for slaves and gold. And when he doesn't find big gold fields, he sets up this incredibly cruel quota system in the province of Sicao.
That's the one where every native over the age of 14 had to bring in a certain amount of gold dust every 3 months.
Yes. And if they failed to meet the quota, the punishment was to have their hands cut off.
And they would just bleed to death.
They would bleed to death. And since the only gold around was little bits of dust in streams, the task was impossible from the start. It was a system designed to kill. The Arawaks responded with mass flight into the mountains, with mass suicide using poison. And the Spanish hunted them with dogs.
The numbers are just staggering.
Zinn lays them out. The Arawak population of Hispaniola was maybe 250,000 when Columbus arrived. By 1550, just over 50 years later, there were only 500 left. By 1650, they were gone, completely wiped out.
And we know about this in such detail because there were people who witnessed it and wrote it down.
People like the priest Bartolomé de las Casas. He's Zinn's key eyewitness. Las Casas saw it all and described how the Spaniards would exasperate, ravage, kill, mangle, and destroy. He wrote about the encomiendas, these huge estates where men were sent miles away to die in the mines while their wives were forced to work the fields.
He mentioned the effect on children, too.
It's one of the most heartbreaking details. He said the forced separations were so total that couples stopped having children. And he reported seeing 7,000 children in Cuba die in just 3 months because their mothers were so overworked and starved they had no milk to give them.
So Zinn uses this documented, undeniable genocide to critique what he calls the historian's moral proportion. He uses a specific example, a very respected Harvard historian.
Samuel Eliot Morison, a celebrated biographer of Columbus. And Morison, in his book, actually acknowledges the horror. He writes on one page about the complete genocide.
So he doesn't hide the fact.
He doesn't hide it, but look at what he does with it. A few pages later, in his final summary, he's praising Columbus's incredible seamanship and indomitable will. And he concludes, this is the key part, that there was no flaw, no dark side, to Columbus's character in that specific respect.
That's just incredible. To acknowledge mass murder and then wrap up with a note of admiration for his sailing skills.
And that, for Zinn, is the system of perception management in action. He says to state the fact of genocide, but then to immediately bury it in a pile of other, seemingly more important facts. It's a way of signaling to the reader.
What's it signaling?
It's signaling with an infectious calm, as he calls it. It says, yes, mass murder took place, but it's not really that important. It shouldn't weigh very heavily in our final judgment. And that learned sense of proportion, that ability to look at an atrocity and just sort of shrug, is how the system stabilizes itself and normalizes its own violence.
So if that initial violence was driven by a lust for personal wealth, Zinn argues that the founding of the United States as a nation was driven by a more structural need for economic power.
Right. The engine of conquest wasn't just individual greed. It was, as you said, what Marx called the primitive accumulation of capital.
Can you break that down a little?
It's basically the idea that to kickstart capitalism, you first need a massive pile of wealth. And the way you get it is through violence, through colonization, conquest, and closing common lands. You violently separate people from their means of survival, like their land, and you concentrate all that stolen wealth into the hands of a few.
So the genocide of the Arawaks and the theft of their land wasn't some unfortunate side effect of exploration.
It was the point. It was the essential bloody foundation that the whole global economic system was then built upon.
And he applies this same economic lens to the American Revolution. The story we learn is about liberty and freedom from tyranny. Zinn sees it as, well, something more calculated.
He sees it as a masterfully engineered transfer of power. Look at who the leaders of the revolution were.
Washington, Hancock, Jefferson, Franklin.
Overwhelmingly wealthy men. The colonial ruling class, they had spent 150 years under British rule, getting very, very rich. From land, from commerce, from slavery. Their main goal was to get rid of the British Empire's control over their economy.
But without upsetting the apple cart at home.
Without disturbing the domestic power structure they had built. They needed to kick the British out. But they had to do it in a way that didn't accidentally empower the poor farmers, indentured servants, and slaves who lived under their control.
A revolution for them, but not for everyone else.
Precisely. So how do you do that? You mobilize the lower classes, the small farmers, the city mechanics, the laborers, with this powerful, inspiring language of liberty and equality.
You get them to fight your war for you.
You get them to fight and die to defeat the British. And, just as importantly, you use that shared struggle to create what he calls a national consensus. But this consensus is built on a massive, deliberate omission.
It conveniently ignores the people who aren't getting any of that liberty and equality.
It ignores the enslaved Africans, the Native Americans whose land was being taken, and the poor whites who were drowning in debt. Their struggles are just not part of the deal.
But the system was clever. It didn't just rely on rhetoric. It gave some of those lower-class whites a tangible stake in the new system.
This is a key part of Zinn's analysis. A lot of land was confiscated from the Loyalists, the colonists who sided with Britain and fled.
So what happened to that land?
Well, some of it went to enrich the revolutionary leaders, of course.
Yeah.
But a significant portion was parceled out to small farmers and soldiers as payment for their service. This was a brilliant move.
Why?
It did two things at once. First, it secured the wealth of the elite. Second, it gave just enough land, just enough of a stake in the new country to that lower middle class. Zinn argues this created a broad base of support for the new government.
It created a buffer class?
A perfect buffer class. The system created, as Zinn puts it, the richest ruling class in history and still have enough for the middle classes to act as a buffer between the rich and the dispossessed. By tying the fortunes of these small farmers to the new state, you make them loyal stakeholders. They become the guardians of a system that is still, fundamentally, a pyramid of wealth.
So if the revolution was about seizing political power, the Constitution was the next logical step, making that power permanent and legal, turning brute force into institutional authority.
Right. And again, the story we learn is that the Constitution is this brilliant document of democratic compromise, forged by wise men.
Zinn, drawing on the work of historian Charles Beard, tells a very different story.
A radically different one. Beard did something very simple back in 1913. He just looked up the financial records of the 55 men who went to the Constitutional Convention.
And what did you find?
He found they were not a cross-section of America. They were overwhelmingly lawyers, merchants, land speculators, and, this is the most important part, bondholders. They had direct personal economic interests that would be massively served by a strong, centralized federal government.
They weren't just creating a government in the abstract. They were creating a government that would protect their own portfolios.
100%. Think about what they needed. Manufacturers wanted tariffs to protect them from foreign competition. Moneylenders needed the government to stop states from printing paper money, which devalued debts.
Land speculators needed the army to clear out Native Americans.
And slave owners needed federal power to help them catch runaways and put down revolts. But the biggest one was the national debt.
The money borrowed to fight the revolution.
Yes. 40 of the 55 delegates held government bonds. Their personal fortunes depended on the new government having the power to tax the entire country to pay them back, with interest. They were essentially creating a system to tax the public to enrich themselves.
And at the same time, huge segments of the population were completely unrepresented at the convention.
4 major groups, Zinn points out. Slaves, indentured servants, women, and men without property, so naturally their interests didn't make it into the final document.
So the real genius of the Constitution, in this view, is how it masks this class bias behind language that seems neutral and universal.
That's its most powerful and, you could say, insidious feature. Take a clause like the one that forbids states from impairing the obligation of contract.
On the surface, that sounds fair. Everyone's contract should be protected.
But think about it. A contract between a rich creditor and a poor debtor, or a powerful employer and a single worker. These are not contracts between equals. One side has all the power to dictate the terms. So when the government steps in to enforce that contract, whose side is it really taking?
It's using its power to back up the person who is already in the stronger position.
Exactly. The law takes the inequality that's already there in the market and it ratifies it. It gives it the stamp of institutional legitimacy. And we see this happen right away with Hamilton's financial plans, which tied the new government to the bankers and merchants. But the most incredible example of this comes later, with the 14th Amendment,
which was passed after the Civil War and was supposed to protect the rights of newly freed slaves.
That was its stated purpose. It says, no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. A landmark of human rights.
But that's not how it was used.
Not primarily, no. The Supreme Court, in a series of decisions, did something remarkable. They reinterpreted the word person to include corporation.
So a corporation became a person under the law.
An artificial person, yes.
Yeah.
And its money was its property,
Right.
and that property was now protected by the 14th Amendment from government regulation or taxation. Zinn cites this incredible statistic. Between 1890 and 1910, the Supreme Court heard 288 cases involving the 14th Amendment that dealt with corporations.
And how many dealt with the rights of African Americans?
19.
Wow.
So you have this legal tool designed to protect one of the most vulnerable human populations in the country, and it gets completely flipped. It becomes the primary legal shield for the most powerful economic entities in the country. That is the illusion of neutrality in its purest form.
Okay, so this raises a huge question. If the whole system, economic, political, legal, was so thoroughly stacked in favor of the wealthy, how did the elite keep control? Why wasn't there just constant, open civil war from the people at the bottom?
Well, Zinn's answer is that there was constant conflict, the resistance was fierce, and it was everywhere. It just gets written out of the standard history books because it wasn't happening in Congress or being led by a president.
And this resistance wasn't just, random riots. It often forced the system to adapt.
It forced concessions. You have to go all the way back to the colonial period. Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 is a huge turning point.
That was in Virginia.
In Virginia. And you had this alliance that terrified the ruling planters. It was poor white frontiersmen, black slaves, and white indentured servants, all uniting over their shared economic misery. They actually burned Jamestown to the ground.
That image of a multiracial alliance of the poor must have been the elite's worst nightmare.
It was their absolute worst nightmare. And after they brutally crushed the rebellion, they learned a critical lesson.
Divide and conquer.
Divide and conquer. The ruling class started making very specific, calculated concessions to poor whites. They expanded voting rights a little, made it easier to get land. It was a conscious strategy to elevate poor whites just enough so that they would start to identify more with their race than with their class.
Creating that racial buffer to prevent any future unity with enslaved blacks.
Exactly. And once the Constitution was in place, the new federal government showed it was more than willing to use force to protect the interests of the wealthy.
You see that with Shays' Rebellion.
Immediately. Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, right before the Constitution was ratified, you had thousands of indebted farmers, many of them Revolutionary War veterans, rising up because their farms were being foreclosed on by Boston bankers. The state raised a private army, paid for by wealthy merchants, to crush them.
The message was clear.
The message was, your debt is a legal problem, not a moral one, and we have the guns to enforce it. Then you get the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. Farmers in western Pennsylvania were furious about a new federal tax on whiskey, which was basically their main currency.
And President Washington himself led troops to put it down.
Personally led 13,000 troops. It was a massive show of force to prove that the new federal government had the power and the will to enforce laws that benefited the financial class on the East Coast.
And as the country industrialized in the 19th century, that fight just moved from the farm to the factory.
It did. And as soon as workers started to organize, the legal system came down on them like a hammer. In the 1830s, the first unions were routinely charged by the courts with being conspiracies to restrain trade.
It was literally illegal to organize.
It was framed as a criminal conspiracy. Zinn quotes a New York judge in 1836 who said that unions were of foreign origin.
There's the scapegoating.
It's a classic tactic. Blame an outside agitator instead of addressing the systemic problem. The conflict just got more and more violent, really exploding in a great railroad strike of 1877. It was a nationwide strike, and federal troops were used again and again to break it, killing scores of workers. It was a clear signal from the state. We are on the side of the robber barons, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers. We are their private army.
And the most organized resistance from farmers came a bit later, with the populist movement.
The populist movement was a massive radical uprising of the Farmers' Alliance in the 1880s and 90s. They were fighting the monopolies that were crushing them, the railroads with their crazy shipping rates, the banks with their high-interest loans.
Their platform was pretty revolutionary for the time.
It was incredible. Their 1892 Omaha platform called for public ownership of railroads, a progressive income tax, and an end to the gold standard. They saw the fight clearly as capital versus labor.
And crucially, They tried to build that same cross-racial alliance that the elite feared so much.
They tried so hard. They reached out to black farmers, arguing that they were all being crushed by the same economic system. One of their leaders said their party existed not just to free the black man, but to emancipate all men. That kind of solidarity was a profound threat to the entire structure of power.
So what happened? How did the system contain such a massive movement?
It was absorbed. It was neutralized by the two-party system. In the 1896 presidential election, the populace made a strategic decision to back the Democratic candidate, William Jennings Bryan.
You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.
That's the one. But Bryan lost to the Republican, William McKinley, who is backed by a mountain of corporate money. And when Bryan lost, the populist movement it collapsed. Its energy was co-opted and then just dissipated inside the established political structure. For Zinn, this is a recurring lesson. The two-party system is a brilliant machine for absorbing and taming genuine mass movements.
Okay, so this history of constant resistance really challenges the idea we're often sold, which is that all the suffering along the way was somehow a necessary evil.
It directly attacks that idea. Zinn is constantly pushing back on this notion that all the bloodshed, all the exploitation was just the unfortunate but necessary price of progress.
The cost of moving from savagery to civilization.
Right. And to accept that is to fall for that infectious calm he talked about. It's to accept atrocity as just a cost of doing business. Zinn forces you to ask, a necessary price for whom? The benefits of American growth and progress flowed overwhelmingly to one group.
The privileged minority at the top.
While the people who actually paid the price, the enslaved, the displaced Native Americans, the factory workers dying in accidents, they were written off as casualties of progress. Zinn's moral argument is simple. If sacrifices are required for progress, then the people making the sacrifice have to be the ones who decide to make it. The ruling class doesn't get to decide to throw other people's children on the fire for a progress that only benefits the rich.
And this connects to the role that war plays in the system, not just as a tool of conquest, but as a way to stabilize the system at home.
He quotes the radical writer Randolph Bourne, who famously said, "War is the health of the state."
What does that mean?
It means war is an incredible tool for creating an artificial sense of unity. It can temporarily override all the fierce class conflict happening inside a country by uniting everyone, rich and poor, against a common external enemy.
So the Civil War wasn't just about slavery.
From a systems perspective, it also served to unite Northern workers and their bosses under the banner of the Union, effectively pausing the intense labor struggles of the 1850s.
And later wars served a similar purpose.
Absolutely. The 1890s were a period of massive economic depression and class warfare. The Spanish-American War in 1898 was perfectly timed to redirect all that rebellious anger outward toward Spain. It's much easier to get people to rally around a flag than to deal with the fact that the system is failing them. This is the pattern Zinn points to again and again. The problems of injustice and exploitation are never really solved. They're just deferred or absorbed or masked by war and patriotism.
So as we shift into a more direct systems analysis, Zinn is making this case that the way history is told is not just an academic exercise. It's a tool to reinforce power right now.
It is fundamentally about reinforcing present-day power structures. A history that focuses on heroes and statesmen teaches ordinary people a lesson in passivity.
How so?
It teaches you to look upward for saviors. When there's a crisis, you wait for a Lincoln or an FDR or a Kennedy to come and fix it. It discourages the very idea that real change comes from ordinary people organizing from below. The most you're expected to do is vote for one of two pre-approved candidates every few years.
And it props up this myth of a common interest.
That myth that the whole nation has one national interest, which conveniently disguises the fact that most policies, whether it's territorial expansion or tax cuts, are designed to serve the dominant economic class. And Zinn makes this really important global point about it, too.
About who pays the price.
Right. He points out that all the gold and silver stolen from the Americas didn't make the average person in Spain any richer. It actually caused runaway inflation, a starving population, and a ruined peasant class. The system sacrifices its own people, regardless of what country they're from, for the short-term benefit of a tiny elite.
Which brings us back to how this system manufactures our consent. It's not always through brute force.
Zinn calls the American system one of the most ingenious systems of control ever devised, precisely because it relies more on consent than on coercion. And it gets that consent by distributing just enough wealth to just enough people.
The middle class.
The white, middle, and working classes. You give them just enough to limit their discontent, to give them a stake in the system.
And they become the buffer.
They become the buffers against the blacks, the Indians, and the very poor whites. The elite can then maintain control with a minimum of overt violence, but with a maximum of law and a very healthy dose of patriotism. And this is all propped up by an ideological orthodoxy that's taught in our most basic institutions.
Schools, churches, popular culture.
And what's the core lesson of that orthodoxy?
That if you're rich, you deserve it, and if you're poor, it's your own fault.
Exactly. Being rich is a sign of your superiority. Being poor is a personal moral failure. It's never a failure of the system. This is a brilliant way to stabilize the pyramid because it stops people from questioning the fairness of the pyramid itself.
And if a historical fact comes along, that threatens that story.
The system has ways of neutralizing it. It uses quiet omission, just leaving the inconvenient facts out. Or, even more effectively, it uses that technique of burying facts in a mass of other information, like we saw with the Columbus example.
So the genocide is mentioned, but it's drowned out.
It's noted, but it's minimized. Its moral weight is diluted until it has no psychological impact. The system prefers not to lie if it can help it. It just wants to dilute the truth until it becomes meaningless.
But when the state does have to use direct violence, it has to reframe that violence to keep its legitimacy.
It has to turn atrocity into a strategy for stability. You think about the deliberate massacres of non-combatants. Cortez did it against the Aztecs. Captain Mason did it against the Pequot tribe, burning a village full of women and children. In the official story, this isn't a war crime.
It's a necessary tactic for victory.
Or it's defensive. Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, saw this clearly back in the 1600s. He said people will always ply to windward, to maintain their wars to be defensive, even when they are obviously the aggressor.
And the law is the tool that launders that violence, that gives it a clean, objective face.
The courts are the key mechanism here. They criminalized unions by calling them conspiracies. The judges were often former corporation lawyers. They were the ones who took the 14th Amendment and made it a tool for corporate power. They transformed the brute force needed to keep people down into this respected institutional authority that we are all taught to obey without question. And then the state backs it all up with force-sending troops, jailing organizers, to constantly teach the lesson that resistance is ultimately futile.
What's so powerful about Zinn's work is that it's not just about the past. It gives you a framework for understanding things happening right now, especially when it comes to public memory. The whole debate around Columbus Day in 1992 is a perfect example of his ideas in action.
That was a huge moment of reckoning. For decades, for centuries really, Columbus Day was just this straightforward celebration of progress and discovery. But the protests around the quincentennial, led mostly by Native American activists, forced the country to confront the other side of the story.
The story of genocide and slavery.
The story that had been comfortably buried. The grand romance was publicly challenged, and you had this huge national crisis in perception.
And it trickled down right into the classroom. It challenged the textbook consensus.
It really did. Teachers all over the country, many of them influenced by Zinn's book, started replacing the old heroic stories with the documented facts about kidnapping, murder, and forced labor. And Zinn talks about the reaction he would get from students.
They were angry.
They were furious. But not just at Columbus. A student is quoted saying something like, "The thought that I have been lied to all my life about this, and who knows what else, really makes me angry."
The anger is at the system that managed their perception. And that same sense of a rigged system comes up when Zinn analyzes modern politics.
Absolutely. He sees the two-party system, Democrats and Republicans, as another ingenious mode of control.
The illusion of choice.
It's the illusion of choice. When there's a lot of unrest, when people are really angry, the system allows you to vote for the slightly more democratic one, as he puts it. And that works to diffuse all that radical energy. But at the end of the day, he argues, both parties are fundamentally tied to corporate wealth and institutional power.
So the debate is always kept within very safe, narrow boundaries that don't threaten the underlying economic structure.
Right. And you see the evidence for this all the time. Polls consistently show that huge majorities of Americans, like 70 or 80%, want certain things. They distrust the government. They think corporations have too much power. They want more help for the poor.
But those desires almost never become policy.
Because the political system is set up to ignore them. It's responsive to its donors, not to the public will.
And when public anger over that gets too high, the system needs a way to redirect it.
It needs to manufacture hobgoblins. Zinn argues that this is a core function of modern politics. You take a public's legitimate anger about their economic situation and you divert it. You aim it at groups who don't have the power to fight back.
Immigrants, criminals, people on welfare.
Or foreign governments,
Okay.
Cuba, Iraq, whoever the enemy of the day is. You create these endless threats to keep the population alarmed and distracted from the real failures of the system at home. That's what H.L. Mencken said. The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed by an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary.
But even with all these control mechanisms, Zinn is not a pessimist. He insists that resistance is a permanent part of the American story.
He finds real hope in what he calls a permanent adversarial culture. He says there are millions of people, largely ignored by the media, who simply refuse to give up on the idea of a more just and equal society.
Environmental groups, women's rights advocates, Native American activists.
Exactly. Prisoners' rights groups. The list goes on. For him, history is the record of this refusal to submit.
So the purpose of writing this kind of history is to keep that memory of resistance alive.
That's the core of it. The whole point is to show these hidden episodes of the past when, even if in brief flashes, people showed their ability to resist. That's where the hope comes from. Because if they could do it then, under horrific conditions, then we can do it now.
And for real change to happen, he argues, it would require a massive coalition.
It would require unifying the energy of all those past movements, the labor struggles, the Black freedom movement, the feminist movement, and critically, combining it with an angry, alienated middle class that finally realizes that they too are ultimately expendable to the people at the very top.
So if we bring all this together and connect it to our show's core themes, Zinn's book is a masterclass in how history functions as a tool for narrative control.
It absolutely is. It shapes the lens through which you see your own life. If you're taught the dominant narrative, you're more likely to believe the current system is fair and just, the inevitable outcome of a heroic journey. It's a national romance designed to make you ignore the cracks in the foundation.
And that power is at its most effective when it's hidden inside things that seem neutral.
Power hidden inside neutrality. That's the most insidious kind. The Constitution, the Supreme Court, the objective history textbook, they all appear to be neutral arbiters serving the common good. But Zinn shows how they actually function to reinforce elite power. The minute the 14th Amendment is used to protect a corporation instead of a person, the mask slips.
And we've talked about how the system normalizes this inequality through these calculated rewards.
That's skillful terracing, as he calls it, to stabilize the pyramid of wealth. You give just enough to the middle class and the white working class to ensure they spend their energy fighting the people below them, often along racial lines, rather than uniting to challenge the tiny number of people at the very top.
Which means that the writing of history itself becomes the primary act of perception management.
That's the whole game. The main mechanism is to bury the uncomfortable truths, the genocide, the class war inside this grand romance of the nation. This manages public perception, it trains us to accept atrocities as the necessary price of progress, and it maintains that infectious calm the system needs to run smoothly.
So when you step back and look at the whole project, what Zinn really helps you see is that American history is not a story of unity.
It's a story of fierce, continuous conflict. You see that law and politics are not neutral referees, they're instruments of class power. And you see that any real progress we've ever made came from people at the bottom, resisting.
It completely changes how you judge historical events and leaders. The question is no longer just, what did the president decide?
The question becomes, how did the system respond to popular pressure, and who paid the price for that decision?
And this reveals that history isn't over. It's unfinished.
Deeply unfinished. The core problems Zinn identifies, class exploitation, racial injustice, militarism, they were never solved. They were just absorbed or masked or kicked down the road for the next generation to deal with. History isn't a closed book. It's a set of recurring struggles.
Which leaves us, the readers, with a certain responsibility, doesn't it?
It leaves us with a huge challenge. Zinn's final message is that the future doesn't depend on us finding the next great leader or savior to rescue us. It depends on us, on ordinary people and their actions.
The choice is to participate or to watch.
To engage in that permanent adversarial culture, or to be a passive spectator, and recognizing that being a spectator is itself a choice with consequences.
It's the ultimate crisis in perception, really. Realizing that the only way forward is to listen to the voices that have been silenced, and to act on that very human impulse to demand dignity against systems of control. It comes back to that final, powerful challenge he leaves us with.
The cry of the poor is not always just, but if you don't listen to it, you will never know what justice is. And counterpoint. This deep dive was based on the landmark work, A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. We encourage you to seek out this essential text and read it for yourself or borrow it from your local library.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini-explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.